October 12th, 2003. The wind came in low across Whitaker County, dragging dust along the gravel road like it had somewhere important to be. By 8 in the morning, half the town had already gathered outside the old red barn at the edge of Sarah Whitaker's land. They weren't there to help. They were there to watch it end. A folding table stood in the dirt papers, weighed down by a rusted wrench. Behind it, in a pressed navy suit that didn't belong in a place like this, stood Daniel Brooks, regional banker, land investor. A man who smiled like he already owned everything he looked at. Sarah stood 20 feet away from him, hands buried in the pockets of a faded work jacket, boots still caked with last night's mud. She hadn't slept. You could see it in the way she blinked slow, like each second had weight. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Daniel said, his voice carrying just enough for the crowd to hear. "We're offering a fair price considering the condition." A few men chuckled. Someone spat tobacco into the dirt. Sarah didn't answer. The land stretched out behind her. 200 acres of uneven ground, hatches of corn, some fallow rows, and a line of old fencing that had seen better decades. To most people standing there, it looked tired, used up, but there was something about the way she stood in front of it. Like it wasn't just land, like it was a line she wasn't ready to let anyone cross. Daniel tapped the papers with his pen. "You've missed 3 payments, Mrs. Whitaker. The bank's been patient, but patience has limits." Still nothing from her. He let out a small laugh, turning slightly toward the crowd. "You know I've seen this before. People get attached to things that stopped working years ago. Old methods, old machines, old ideas." A few louder laughs this time, and the truth is, he continued looking back at her, "this land isn't worth saving the way you're trying to save it." That one landed. You could feel it shift something in the air. Sarah's fingers tightened inside her pockets, but her face didn't change. Daniel took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal. "Sell now. Walk away with something. Or hold on and lose everything. That's not pride. That's just stubbornness." Someone behind him said, "She still plows with that antique tractor, doesn't she?" Another voice answered, "Yeah, like it's 1950 or something." More laughter. Daniel smiled. "Exactly my point." He gestured out toward the fields. "This isn't farming anymore. This is nostalgia." For a moment it looked like Sarah might speak, but she didn't. Instead, she reached into her jacket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and walked toward the table. And for just a second, just a flicker, something passed through her eyes. Not defeat. Something quieter. Something harder to name. What happened in the next few minutes would be talked about in that county for years, but not for the reasons anyone there expected, because what nobody understood that morning was that this story had started long before Daniel Brooks ever set foot on that land. And it wasn't really about the money. It never was. Sarah Whitaker had been walking those fields since before she could remember her own age. Her father, Thomas Whitaker, used to wake her before sunrise, back when the world still felt bigger than it does when you're grown. He didn't talk much either. Most mornings they worked in silence, the kind that wasn't empty, just full of things that didn't need saying. He had a way of looking at the soil like it was telling him something, and in a way it was. "Land's not just dirt," he told her once, kneeling down and letting it run through his fingers. "It remembers what you do to it." She didn't understand that then, not fully, but she remembered the way he said it, slow, certain, like it mattered. Back in 1983, a flood came through Whitaker County that nearly wiped everything out. The river rose higher than anyone had seen in decades, pushing silt and debris across acres of farmland. Neighbors packed up and left. Some never came back, but Thomas stayed. Everyone said he was crazy, said the land was ruined, said it would take generations to recover if it ever did, but he didn't argue with them. He just worked. Day after day, season after season, he changed the way he farmed. Less about forcing the land to produce, more about letting it rebuild. Rotating crops in ways that didn't make sense to most people, leaving sections untouched when others would have planted. digging deeper, but somehow disturbing less. And there was something else, something almost nobody ever paid attention to. The tractor. It was an old John Deere Model 4020, even back then, already considered outdated. Faded green paint. Engine that coughed in the cold. No electronics. No automation. But Thomas never replaced it. Not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. "I trust what I can feel," he used to say. Years later, Sarah would discover that her father had done something unusual to that machine. Not flashy, not obvious, but deliberate. Adjustments to the plow depth, modifications to the torque, balance changes that allowed it to work the soil differently. Deeper in some places, gentler in others. He never wrote any of it down. He just knew, and he taught Sarah the same way. Not with instructions, with time. When Thomas died in 1997, most people assumed the farm would be sold within a year. Sarah had just lost her husband 2 winters before that. No children, no workforce. Just one woman and 200 acres of land that people already believed was dying. They were already placing bets on how long she'd last. But she stayed, not because it was easy, because leaving never felt like an option. And over time, something strange began to happen. The parts of the land her father had worked differently, held moisture longer. Crops didn't grow faster, but they lasted. Where neighboring farms needed more input every year, hers didn't change much. But from the outside, then it didn't look impressive, not the way modern farms did. No towering machines, no perfect symmetry, no quick results, just steady, quiet work. And a woman who never explained herself, which in a place like that was the same as inviting people to misunderstand you. By the time Daniel Brooks arrived in Whitaker County in the early 2000s, he saw opportunity. Cheap land, aging farmers, outdated methods. He'd built his reputation buying underperforming farms, modernizing them, and flipping them into high-yield operations, backed by investors who never had to touch the soil themselves. And when he looked at Sarah's land, he didn't see history. He saw inefficiency. He started buying everything around her first. Neighbors who were tired. Families ready to move on. Plots that hadn't recovered since the flood years. Within 18 months, Daniel owned more land in that county than anyone else, except Sarah. And that bothered him more than he let on, because her land sat right in the middle of his expansion. A gap in the map. An old piece that didn't fit the new picture he was trying to build. So he did what men like him always do. He tried to make it make sense. He sent offers, then better offers, then warnings, and finally, he showed up in person. That morning in October wasn't just about debt. It was about control, about proving a point, about showing everyone watching that the old way was finished, and that people like Sarah were just holding on to something already gone. But there was one thing Daniel didn't understand. Not yet, and it was the kind of thing you don't notice until it's already too late to ignore. Because while he was measuring land in acres and profit margins, Sarah was measuring something else entirely. Something slower, something quieter, something that over time would change everything. What happened after that morning didn't look like a battle, at least not at first. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations, no moment where Sarah stood in the middle of the road and refused to move. Instead, things changed quietly. And that was exactly why nobody saw it coming. By the spring of 2004, Daniel Brooks had already begun reshaping the land around her. New equipment rolled in before the frost had even fully lifted. Massive tractors with enclosed cabins. GPS-guided planting systems. Rows mapped out with precision so perfect it almost looked artificial. People came from neighboring counties just to see it. "It's the future," someone said one morning at the diner. "About time this place caught up," another replied. And for a while, it looked like they were right. Daniel's fields came up fast, neat, even aggressively green. Fertilizer trucks moved in and out like clockwork. Irrigation systems ran with mathematical efficiency. Everything about it spoke the same language: speed, output, control. And right in the middle of it all was Sarah's land. Uneven rows, sections left unplanted. A tractor that coughed to life instead of humming. From the outside, it looked like a mistake that hadn't been corrected yet. Daniel made sure people noticed. You see that he said one afternoon standing with a group of investors at the edge of his property line, pointing towards Sarah's fields. That's what happens when you refuse to adapt. One of the men laughed. Looks like she's digging her own grave out there. Daniel smiled just slightly. No, the land's doing that for her. They all chuckled, but there was something about the way he kept glancing back at her fields, like he was waiting for something to confirm what he already believed, because despite everything, she hadn't failed yet. The first harvest season came, and on paper Daniel won. His yields were higher, his numbers cleaner, his reports impressive enough to attract more outside money. More land changed hands, more farmers sold, and each time Daniel expanded just a little further, but something small, almost invisible, began to shift. Not in the numbers, in the soil. The second year, his fields needed more input, more fertilizer, more water. Nothing unusual, he told himself, just part of scaling. By the third year, there were sections that didn't produce the same way they had before, patches where the growth looked thinner, less certain, still profitable, but different. And that's when he started noticing her again. Not because she was louder, because she wasn't. While his operation grew bigger, faster, more complex, hers stayed almost exactly the same. Same tractor, same slow, deliberate pace, same way of working the land like she was listening to it instead of forcing it. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't have worked. And yet, it did. There's something I need to stop and tell you here, because this is the part most people misunderstood. They thought Sarah was holding on to the past, that she was stubborn, resistant to change. But that wasn't true. Not even close. She changed, just not in ways people could see. Because what nobody outside her land understood was that she wasn't trying to make the soil produce more. She was trying to make it last. And that difference, it doesn't show up in the first year, sometimes not even the fifth, but it shows up eventually, and when it does, it changes everything. The truth goes back to something her father did after the flood in 1983, something so quiet, so gradual, that even the neighbors who lived through it didn't fully grasp it. When the river overflowed, it didn't just bring destruction, it brought something else. Layers of fine silt, mineral-rich deposits that settled deep into the land, unevenly spread across the county. Most farmers saw it as damage. Thomas Whitaker saw it as potential, but only if it was handled the right way. Instead of scraping it away or forcing immediate crops, he did something almost no one else did. He let parts of the land rest, years at a time. He rotated crops in patterns that didn't maximize short-term yield, but rebuilt structure underneath. He paid attention to how water moved through the soil, where it stayed, where it drained, and slowly, quietly, he changed the composition of that land, not on the surface, deep underneath. And here's the part nobody knew, not Daniel, not the investors, not even most of the farmers who had worked nearby for decades. The sections Sarah never sold, the ones she held on to no matter how much pressure came her way, were the exact sections her father had rebuilt. The richest parts of the land, the parts that didn't just grow crops, but held life inside them. And that old tractor everyone laughed at, it wasn't just old. It was tuned, adjusted in ways that made no sense to anyone who hadn't learned directly from Thomas. It didn't tear through the soil like modern machines. It worked with it, maintaining layers, preserving moisture, keeping something intact that most machines unknowingly destroyed. But none of that was visible from the road. All people saw was a woman falling behind. By the 6th year, the difference became harder to ignore. Daniel's costs had doubled, not publicly, of course, not in the reports he showed investors, but internally. The margins were tightening. More chemicals, more irrigation, more adjustments to compensate for something he couldn't quite explain. The land wasn't responding the way it used to. And then came the summer of 2009, the kind of summer people still talk about. No rain for weeks, then months. The ground cracked open in places. Cornfields across the county turned brittle leaves curling in on themselves like they were trying to disappear. One by one, farmers started losing their crops. Even Daniel's operations, built on precision and control, couldn't fight something like that forever. Water reserves dropped. Costs spiked. And still, the land kept drying. But there was one place Just one, where the green didn't fade. At first, people thought it was a trick of the light. Then they drove closer. Then they stopped their trucks at the edge of the field and just stared, because Sarah Whitaker's land was still alive. Not perfect, not untouched, but alive. Rows holding their color, soil still dark beneath the surface, and that old tractor moving slowly across it like it had all the time in the world. No rush, no panic, just steady, deliberate work. What happened next was the moment everything began to change. Because for the first time, people stopped laughing and started asking questions, the kind of questions that don't come with easy answers. And Daniel Brooks, for the first time since he arrived in Whitaker County, didn't have one ready. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, it was just trucks slowing down along the road. Farmers leaning out their windows staring a little longer than they used to. No one said anything out loud. Not yet. But word travels differently in places like Whitaker County. It doesn't need to be spoken clearly to be understood. By late August of that drought year, something had become impossible to ignore. Daniel's fields were failing. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. Sections of corn stood stunted, brittle, uneven. Entire rows never fully developed. Soil that had once been soft and workable now broke apart like powder in the hand. And the more he tried to fix it, the worse it seemed to respond. He doubled irrigation, adjusted nutrient mixes, brought in consultants from Des Moines. Each one came with charts, projections, solutions. Each one left with the same quiet uncertainty, because the problem wasn't on the surface, and that made it harder to fight. Meanwhile, Sarah didn't change a thing. She didn't bring in new systems, didn't suddenly expand, didn't stand in front of anyone and explain what was happening. She just kept moving across that land in the same slow, steady rhythm, and somehow her fields held. By the time harvest came that year, Daniel wasn't smiling anymore. The numbers told a story he couldn't spin. Losses, not catastrophic, but undeniable. Enough to make investors ask questions. Enough to make him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. And that's when he did something he hadn't done before. He walked onto her land. No suit this time, no crowd, just boots sinking slightly into soil that felt different. He found her near the far end of the field, shutting down the old tractor as the sun dropped low behind the trees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said it. "How are you doing it?" No arrogance in his voice now, no performance, just a question. Sarah wiped her hands on a rag, glanced out across the field, then back at him. "It's not about doing more," she said quietly. He frowned. "That's not an answer." She nodded slightly. "That's the problem." He didn't like that. You could see it, because men like Daniel don't struggle with effort. They struggle with things that don't follow rules they understand. "This land should have dried out," he said. "Same as everything else." "It didn't," she replied. "Why?" She looked down at the soil beneath her boots, then back at him. "You've been asking the wrong question." He waited, but she didn't say anything else. And that silence said more than anything she could have explained. What happened next wasn't loud, but it spread. Farmers who had sold their land started coming back, just to look. Some of them walked the edges of her fields, crouching down, touching the soil, like they were trying to remember something they had forgotten. And slowly, the narrative began to change. Not overnight, but steadily. People stopped calling her stubborn, stopped calling her outdated, started calling her something else. Careful, patient, different. Daniel heard it. Of course he did. And the more he heard it, the more it pressed against something inside him he couldn't ignore. Because deep down, he knew what it meant. It meant he had been wrong. 20 years passed the way time always does in places like that. Not in big moments, in seasons, planting, growing, harvesting, again and again. And somewhere along the way, something remarkable happened. Sarah Whitaker didn't just survive. She expanded, not aggressively, not all at once, but piece by piece. Every time someone gave up on a patch of land that wasn't worth it anymore, she was there, quietly buying, quietly restoring, working it the same way her father had taught her. By 2023, the map of Whitaker County looked very different than it had in 2003. Daniel's operation still existed, but it had shrunk. Costs had caught up. Margins had thinned. Investors had moved on to easier opportunities, and slowly, he had been forced to sell. First small sections, then larger ones, and finally, the core of what he had built. The day of the auction came in early November. Cold air, gray sky. The kind of day that makes everything feel heavier than it is. People gathered again, just like they had 20 years before. Same road, same land, but not the same story. Daniel stood near the front this time, not in a suit, just a coat that didn't quite fit the way it used to. He didn't speak much, didn't need to. Everyone already knew. When the bidding started, it moved quickly. A few local buyers, some outside interest, but there was one name that kept coming up. Again, and again, and again. Sarah Whitaker. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush, just lifted her hand when it mattered, and each time, the room adjusted around her, until finally, it was over, the last piece of Daniel's land. Sold. To her, there was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just a silence that felt complete, because everyone there understood what it meant. 20 years earlier, she had stood, being told to sell everything before she lost it. Now, she owned more land than the man who had said it. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, like he wanted to say something. Maybe apologize, maybe explain. But in the end, he didn't, because some things don't need words. Sarah signed the papers the same way she always did. Calm, steady, unshaken. And when it was done, she simply folded them, nodded once, and walked away. No victory speech, no celebration, just another day. After that, people expected her to change, to become something bigger, more visible. But she didn't. She kept the same routines, same tractor, same quiet way of moving through the fields. The only difference was the size of the land she moved across. Farmers who had once laughed at her started asking for advice. Some she helped, some she just listened to. She never reminded anyone of what had happened, never brought up the past. And that was the part that stayed with people the most. As for Daniel, he left Whitaker County not long after. No scandal, no dramatic fall, just a quiet exit. The kind that happens when a man realizes he's been measuring the wrong things for too long. There's a story people still tell out there, not about money, not about land, about a morning in 2003 when a woman stood in front of everything she had and was told it wasn't worth saving, and about what happened 20 years later. But if you listen closely, the story isn't really about winning. It's about understanding. Because the truth is, most people don't lose because they lack effort. They lose because they never take the time to understand what they're working with. And sometimes, the quiet ones, the ones nobody pays attention to, aren't falling behind. They're building something that just takes longer to see, something deeper, something that doesn't show up right away. But when it does, it doesn't just change the outcome. It changes the meaning of everything that came before it. And by then, it's already too late to laugh.